Atlantis is often described as the greatest lost civilization in history, a powerful society said to vanish beneath the ocean. But what if its story didn't end with a natural disaster alone? Some interpretations of the Emerald Tablets and Thoth traditions suggest that Atlantis fell during a time of great imbalance, when knowledge and power were misused. Thoth, known as a keeper of wisdom, is believed by some to have preserved parts of this knowledge so it would not disappear forever. At its height, Atlantis was dazzling. Imagine an island kingdom where canals glistened like silver ribbons under the sun, where temples rose so high they seemed to challenge the clouds, and where libraries overflowed with scrolls capturing the wisdom of ages. The Atlanteans were astronomers who charted the heavens with uncanny precision, engineers who built structures that defied storms, healers who blended herbs with chants in ways that seemed almost magical. To outsiders, Atlantis was perfection. To Thoth, it was brilliance, balanced precariously on pride. The people believed themselves chosen, destined to rule not only the seas, but perhaps the skies. Their ships were vast, their armies disciplined, their scholars endlessly curious. They spoke of harmony, of balance between man and nature, and for a time they lived as though the gods themselves had blessed their every endeavor. But beneath the grandeur, Thoth observed the subtle cracks forming. Pride crept in like a tide, rising slowly but steadily. Kings began to declare themselves divine, priests turned rituals into spectacles, and scholars hoarded discoveries instead of sharing them. Was Atlantis destroyed by catastrophe, by human choices, or by cycles of nature described in ancient traditions? Perhaps all three. And if Thoth witnessed its fall, his lesson was clear. Civilizations rise and fall, but wisdom endures only when tempered by humility. Tonight, we explore the legends, interpretations, and mysteries surrounding the fall of Atlantis, and what Thoth's teachings may suggest about its fate. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And let me know from where you're watching, whether it's from a blanket fort, a couch kingdom, or pretending you're studying while secretly drifting off to sleep. Atlantis was not merely a city of grandeur. It was a civilization that seemed centuries ahead of its time. According to traditions linked to Thoth, the Atlanteans possessed knowledge that bridged the worlds of science, spirituality, and art. Their society thrived on innovation, and their achievements were so advanced that later cultures often described them as almost mythical. The Atlanteans were master astronomers. They charted the heavens with precision, predicting eclipses and tracking planetary movements long before other civilizations had even named the stars. Their temples were aligned with celestial events, serving not only as places of worship, but also as observatories. To them, the sky was a vast library, and they read it with the same devotion as they read their scrolls. Their engineering was equally remarkable. They built canals that carried water across the island like veins of silver, ensuring fertile fields and abundant harvests. Their ships were vast and sturdy, capable of crossing oceans with ease. Some accounts suggest they experimented with metals unknown to other cultures, forging tools and ornaments that shimmered with strange energies. Medicine in Atlantis blended the practical with the mystical. Healers combined herbs, chants, and rituals, creating treatments that seemed to merge science with spirituality. They believed illness was not only physical, but also a disruption of balance, And so healing required restoring harmony between body, mind, and spirit. Art and philosophy flourished as well. The Atlanteans carved statues that captured both beauty and symbolism, painted murals that told stories of gods and heroes, and wrote texts that explored the nature of existence. Their libraries overflowed with scrolls, preserving knowledge that, according to Thoth, was meant to guide humanity for generations. But perhaps the most striking aspect of Atlantis was its pursuit of harmony. The people spoke often of balance between man and nature, between wisdom and humility, between power and responsibility. For a time, they lived as though the gods themselves had blessed their every endeavor. Yet Thoth, ever the observer, noted that such brilliance was fragile. Knowledge, if misused, could become dangerous. Power, if unchecked, could corrupt. Atlantis stood as a beacon of human potential, but also as a reminder that even the greatest civilizations must tread carefully when walking the line between wisdom and pride. For all its brilliance, Atlantis was not built solely on ambition and innovation. According to traditions linked to Thoth, the Atlanteans understood that knowledge without balance could be dangerous. They believed their prosperity depended on harmony between humanity and nature, between wisdom and humility, between the spiritual and the material. The island kingdom was filled with rituals designed to preserve this equilibrium. Priests performed ceremonies to honor the gods of the sea and sky, offering thanks for calm waters and fertile fields. Farmers worked in rhythm with the seasons, guided by astronomical observations that aligned planting and harvest with celestial cycles. Scholars debated not only the mechanics of the universe, but also the moral responsibilities of wielding such knowledge. Atlantis tried to maintain balance through its laws as well. Kings were expected to rule not as tyrants, but as stewards, guardians of both people and land. Councils of advisors reminded rulers that power was temporary, while wisdom was eternal. Even their architecture reflected this principle. Temples aligned with solstices, canals designed to flow in harmony with tides, and statues carved to symbolize the unity of man and nature. Yet balance is fragile. Thoth, ever the observer, noted that while Atlantis spoke often of harmony, the practice of it was more difficult. Pride crept in slowly, like a tide rising against the shore. Rituals became spectacles, laws bent to favor the powerful, and scholars began to guard their discoveries rather than share them. The balance they cherished began to tilt, and with it, the destiny of Atlantis. Still, the effort to maintain equilibrium remains one of the most fascinating aspects of their civilization. Atlantis was not destroyed because it ignored balance entirely. It was destroyed because it failed to protect it consistently. Thoth's writings suggest that this struggle is universal. Every civilization must wrestle with the tension between wisdom and pride, between harmony and ambition. Atlantis, for all its brilliance, was no exception. For a time, Atlantis seemed to embody the perfect balance between wisdom and prosperity. Its kings were respected, its priests revered, and its scholars admired. But as Thoth observed, balance is fragile, and pride has a way of creeping in quietly, like a tide rising against the shore. The kings of Atlantis began to see themselves not merely as rulers, but as divine figures. Their palaces grew larger, their crowns heavier, and their proclamations bolder. What had once been stewardship of the people and land slowly transformed into a pursuit of glory. The priests, too, shifted their role. Rituals that were once solemn acts of reverence became grand spectacles, designed to impress crowds and reinforce authority. Scholars, who had once shared discoveries freely, began to guard their knowledge. Scrolls were locked away, experiments hidden, and wisdom became a currency of power rather than a gift to the community. The Atlanteans, once united by the pursuit of harmony, began to fracture into classes defined by access to knowledge and influence. Thoth recorded these changes with a steady hand, noting that the misuse of sacred knowledge was the first true crack in Atlantis's foundation. Wisdom, when turned into a tool of dominance, loses its purity. The Atlanteans believed they were invincible, that their brilliance would shield them from consequence. But in truth, the scales of balance had already begun to tip. The shift in power was subtle at first, but it set the stage for everything that followed. Atlantis was no longer a civilization guided by humility. It was a kingdom driven by ambition. An ambition unchecked would soon invite the storms that would swallow it whole. Atlantis, for all its brilliance, began to show cracks beneath its polished surface. Thoth noted that imbalance rarely arrives with thunder and lightning at first. It creeps in quietly, disguised as progress, ambition, and pride. The signs of instability were subtle at the beginning. Earthquakes rattled the island more frequently, though the kings dismissed them as ordinary tremors. Storms grew stronger, battering the coasts with waves that seemed to rise higher each season. Farmers whispered that the soil was less fertile, that the tides were shifting in ways they had never seen before. But the greatest instability was not in the earth or sea, it was in the hearts of the people. The kings demanded more tribute, priests demanded more spectacle, and scholars demanded more secrecy. The balance that had once defined Atlantis was slipping, and with it came unrest. The poor began to feel neglected, the middle classes burdened, and the elites intoxicated by their own power. Thoth recorded omens in the skies, strange alignments of stars, eclipses that seemed to arrive too soon, and comets that streaked across the heavens like warnings. To him, these were not coincidences, but signals that the cycle was turning. Civilizations, he believed, rose and fell in rhythm with nature, and Atlantis was beginning to falter. The people themselves noticed the changes. Fishermen spoke of waters that grew unpredictable, sailors of currents that pulled their ships off course. Merchants complained of shortages, artisans of dwindling resources. Yet the rulers pressed forward, convinced that their brilliance could overcome any obstacle. Signs of instability were everywhere, but pride made them invisible to those in power. Atlantis was still magnificent, still dazzling to outsiders. But beneath the marble and gold, the foundations were beginning to tremble. And Thoth, ever the scribe, knew that the story was shifting from triumph to tragedy. As Atlantis began to tremble under the weight of its own pride, voices rose in warning. Thoth, the divine scribe, was among those who recorded the signs, but he was not alone. Sages, priests, and ordinary citizens whispered of omens that foretold disaster. These warnings, though often ignored by rulers intoxicated with power, were preserved in traditions that survived long after the island itself was gone. The priests spoke of imbalance in their rituals. They noticed that offerings no longer calmed the seas, that prayers no longer brought fertile rains. They warned that the gods were displeased, that Atlantis had strayed from its path of harmony. Farmers told stories of crops failing despite careful planting, of tides shifting unpredictably, of animals behaving strangely. Sailors reported currents that pulled their ships off course, as if the ocean itself was rebelling. Thoth recorded celestial signs, eclipses that arrived too soon, comets streaking across the sky, and stars aligning in patterns that suggested endings rather than beginnings. To him, these were not random events, but signals of a cycle turning. Civilizations, he believed, rose and fell in rhythm with nature, and Atlantis was nearing its fall. The warnings were preserved in chants, carved into stone, and passed down through oral traditions. Even after Atlantis vanished beneath the waves, echoes of these warnings appeared in myths across cultures. Flood stories in Mesopotamia, tales of great deluges in India, and legends of drowned lands in Europe all carried fragments of the same message. Imbalance invites destruction. Yet the rulers of Atlantis dismissed these voices. They built taller monuments, commanded larger armies, and declared themselves invincible. The warnings, though preserved, became whispers, drowned out by the roar of ambition. And so, the traditions endured not as tools to save Atlantis, but as lessons for those who came after. They remind us that civilizations often ignore the signs of their own decline, but the warnings remain etched into myth and memory, waiting for future generations to listen. In Atlantis, knowledge was never seen as ordinary. It was sacred, a gift believed to come from the gods, entrusted to humanity with the expectation that it would be used wisely. According to traditions linked to Thoth, the Atlanteans treated wisdom as both a tool and a responsibility, weaving it into every aspect of their civilization. Sacred knowledge guided their rituals. Priests studied the stars, not only to predict celestial events, but to align ceremonies with cosmic rhythms. They believed that harmony between the heavens and the earth was essential for prosperity. Farmers planted according to lunar cycles, healers invoked chants alongside herbs, and architects designed temples that mirrored constellations. Every act was infused with reverence for the unseen forces that governed existence. This knowledge was also preserved in texts and symbols. Scrolls filled with astronomical calculations, philosophical debates, and spiritual teachings were stored in vast libraries. Statues and carvings encoded lessons in geometry and proportion, serving as silent teachers for those who could interpret them. To the Atlanteans, wisdom was not just written, it was embodied in stone, ritual, and tradition. But sacred knowledge was not meant to be hoarded. Thoth emphasized that wisdom was a bridge between humanity and the divine, a way to maintain balance and harmony. When shared, it uplifted society. When guarded selfishly, it became corrupted. Atlantis thrived as long as its people respected this principle. But once knowledge became a tool of power rather than guidance, the balance began to falter. The role of sacred knowledge in Atlantis was profound. It shaped their science, their spirituality, their governance, and their daily lives. It was the heartbeat of their civilization. Yet Thoth's writings remind us that wisdom, no matter how advanced, is fragile when misused. Atlantis's downfall was not because it lacked knowledge, but because it forgot the sacred responsibility that came with it. Atlantis thrived because it treated knowledge as sacred, a gift meant to guide humanity toward harmony. But as Thoth observed, wisdom can be fragile when pride begins to twist its purpose. What was once revered as a bridge between humanity and the divine slowly became a weapon, a tool of control, and a currency of influence. The priests, who had once performed rituals to honor the gods and maintain balance, began to use ceremonies as spectacles of authority. Their chants and symbols, once meant to connect people with the cosmos, became demonstrations of power designed to awe crowds and reinforce their dominance. The sacred knowledge they guarded was no longer shared freely. It was hoarded, whispered only among the elite. Scholars, too, shifted their role. Discoveries that could have uplifted society were locked away in libraries accessible only to the privileged. Knowledge became a secret language, a way to separate the powerful from the ordinary. The scrolls that once carried wisdom for all now served as instruments of exclusion. Even the kings embraced this transformation. They declared themselves divine, claiming that their authority was sanctioned by the very wisdom of the gods. Palaces grew larger, monuments taller, armies stronger, all fueled by the belief that Atlantis's brilliance made it untouchable. Wisdom, once a guiding light, had become a crown of arrogance. Thoth recorded these changes with a steady hand, noting that the misuse of sacred knowledge was the true turning point in Atlantis's story. When wisdom turns into power, it loses its purity. It ceases to guide and begins to dominate. The Atlanteans believed their brilliance would shield them from consequence, but in truth, it was the very thing that invited their downfall. Atlantis still glittered on the surface, dazzling to outsiders, but beneath the marble and gold, its soul was shifting. The balance was gone, replaced by ambition, and Thoth, but of a civilization walking steadily toward its own destruction. The fall of Atlantis, as preserved in traditions linked to Thoth, was not a simple tale of catastrophe. It was layered with meaning, symbolism, and warnings that invited interpretation. Thoth, the divine scribe, was believed to have recorded the events not only as history, but as lessons for future generations. And so, his messages became a canvas upon which countless seekers, mystics, and scholars painted their own understandings. Some interpreted Thoth's writings literally. To them, Atlantis was a real island kingdom swallowed by the sea, its destruction a direct result of arrogance and imbalance. They saw his words as a historical account, a record of a civilization that rose too high and fell too fast. These interpreters searched for physical evidence, ruins beneath the waves, anomalies in the earth, and echoes of Atlantean culture in distant lands. Others viewed Thoth's messages symbolically. They believed Atlantis represented the human soul, a metaphor for the dangers of pride and the importance of balance. The destruction of the island was not about earthquakes and floods, but about the collapse of wisdom when it is misused. In this view, Atlantis was less a place and more a parable, a timeless reminder that civilizations, like individuals, must guard against arrogance. Mystics and philosophers added yet another layer. They saw Thoth's account as part of a larger cycle, the rise and fall of civilizations across ages. To them, Atlantis was one chapter in a repeating story, proof that humanity advances, falters, and begins again. The emerald tablets, often linked to Thoth, were interpreted as guides to transformation, suggesting that the fall of Atlantis was not an end, but a rebirth. Thoth's messages, therefore, became mirrors. Each generation looked into them and saw reflections of its own concerns, warnings against greed, encouragement toward humility, or prophecies of cycles yet to come. The ambiguity of his words ensured their endurance. Whether literal, symbolic, or cyclical, they carried lessons that transcended time. And so, interpretations of Thoth's messages kept Atlantis alive. The island may have vanished beneath the waves, but in the minds of seekers it remained a legend, a warning, and a mystery that continues to invite reflection. Thoth's account of Atlantis did not end with the image of a single catastrophe. Instead, he described the fall of civilizations as part of a greater rhythm, a cycle that repeats across ages. To him, Atlantis was not unique in its rise and collapse. It was one chapter in a story that humanity has lived many times before. The idea of cyclical destruction was central to his teachings. Civilizations rise with brilliance, flourish with innovation, and then falter when pride outweighs humility. Nature, in Thoth's view, acts as a balancing force. When imbalance grows to great, the earth corrects itself through floods, earthquakes, storms, or other upheavals. What seems like disaster is, in truth, renewal. Atlantis was the most famous example, but Thoth suggested that countless others had risen and fallen before it. Each cycle carried lessons forward, fragments of wisdom preserved in myths, traditions, and sacred texts. The emerald tablets, often linked to Thoth, spoke of these cycles as inevitable, reminding humanity that destruction is not the end but the beginning of transformation. This perspective reframed Atlantis's fate. It was not merely a tragedy, nor simply punishment for arrogance. It was part of a cosmic rhythm, a reminder that all things, kingdoms, temples, even oceans, move in cycles. Just as the moon waxes and wanes, just as seasons change, so too do civilizations. The idea of cyclical destruction also explained why flood stories appear across cultures. From Mesopotamia to India, from Egypt to the Americas, tales of waters rising and lands vanishing echo the same theme. Humanity forgets balance. Nature restores it, and life begins anew. Atlantis was one of many, but it became the most enduring symbol of this truth. Thoth's message was clear. Destruction is not chaos, but correction. It is the universe's way of reminding humanity that wisdom must be tempered with humility, and that balance must always be preserved. Atlantis fell, but in its fall, it joined the eternal rhythm of rise, decline, and renewal, a rhythm that continues to shape the destiny of civilizations even today. The story of Atlantis, as Thoth preserved it, did not exist in isolation. Across the world, cultures carried memories of great floods, deluges that swept away cities, reshaped landscapes, and marked the end of entire ages. These flood traditions, echoing through myth and ritual, became part of humanity's collective memory, and they aligned strikingly with the tale of Atlantis's sudden disappearance. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh spoke of waters rising to cover the earth, a divine act meant to cleanse humanity of arrogance. In India, ancient texts described cycles of destruction and renewal, with floods washing away civilizations before new ones emerged. In Greece, the story of Deucalion told of a deluge sent by the gods, leaving only a handful of survivors to repopulate the land. Even in the Americas, indigenous traditions spoke of waters that swallowed entire peoples, leaving behind lessons of humility and survival. Thoth's account of Atlantis fit neatly into this chorus of flood memories. He described the seas rising with fury, swallowing fields and temples, erasing the brilliance of a civilization in a single night. To him, this was not merely a local disaster, but part of a larger rhythm, the Earth's way of restoring balance when humanity strayed too far from harmony. These flood memories were preserved because they carried meaning beyond the events themselves. They were warnings, reminders that nature is both nurturing and unforgiving, that civilizations must respect the forces that sustain them. The Atlanteans ignored the signs, believing their brilliance could defy the sea. The flood proved otherwise. What makes these traditions remarkable is their universality. Cultures separated by oceans and centuries told stories with the same theme. Imbalance invites destruction, and water becomes the agent of renewal. Atlantis was one of the most famous examples, but it was not alone. The flood memories remind us that humanity has always lived in cycles of rise, fall, and rebirth, and that the lessons of balance are as old as the tides themselves. When Atlantis finally met its end, Thoth described it not as a slow decline but as a sudden global event, a moment when the balance tipped so sharply that nature itself responded with overwhelming force. The island, once radiant with temples and canals, was shaken by earthquakes that split the ground, storms that roared across the seas, and waves that rose higher than any ship could withstand. The destruction was swift. Fields that had fed thousands were swallowed in hours. Temples that had stood for centuries crumbled in minutes, and towers that had touched the clouds vanished beneath the ocean before dawn. What had taken generations to build was undone in a single night. But Thoth's account suggests that Atlantis's fall was not isolated. The tremors, floods, and storms rippled outward, affecting distant lands. Rivers overflowed, coastlines shifted, and communities far from Atlantis spoke of strange disruptions. It was as if the earth itself had convulsed, reshaping not only one island, but the wider world. This sudden global event became the seed of countless flood traditions. Cultures across continents remembered waters rising, lands vanishing, and survivors wandering in search of refuge. Though each story carried its own details, the theme was the same. Imbalance invites destruction, and nature restores balance with overwhelming force. For Atlantis, the event was catastrophic. Yet Thoth's writings remind us that it was also part of a cycle. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall, and in their fall they leave behind lessons. The suddenness of Atlantis's destruction was not meant to terrify, but to teach. Greatness without humility can vanish in an instant, and the earth will always reclaim what is out of balance. The global echoes of Atlantis's fall ensured that its memory endured, even as the island disappeared beneath the waves. Its story lived on in myths, traditions, and warnings carried across generations, a reminder that the world itself can change in a single night. The end of Atlantis was not a slow unraveling stretched across centuries. According to Thoth's account, it was sudden, shocking, and absolute. One moment the island stood proud, its temples gleaming in the sun, its canals flowing with abundance, its people confident in their brilliance. The next, the earth convulsed, the seas roared, and the sky darkened with omens that no one could ignore. Earthquakes split the ground, tearing apart palaces and marketplaces alike. Towers that had touched the clouds collapsed in an instant, their stones tumbling into the streets. The canals, once symbols of ingenuity, became rivers of destruction as waters surged through them with unstoppable force. The ocean rose higher than anyone believed possible, swallowing fields, villages, and monuments in a single sweep. The speed of the disaster was what made it unforgettable. Generations of achievement vanished in hours, Scrolls filled with wisdom dissolved in salt water, statues crumbled into rubble, and ships that might have carried people to safety were smashed against the rocks before they could leave the harbor. Families who had lived in prosperity for centuries found themselves clinging to fragments of wood swept into the endless sea. Thoth described the fall as a lesson in impermanence. What takes centuries to build can be undone in a single night. The Atlanteans believed their brilliance made them invincible, but nature reminded them otherwise. The swiftness of their destruction was not only a tragedy, but also a warning. Imbalance does not wait patiently. When the scales tip, the correction can come with terrifying speed. And so Atlantis disappeared almost instantly, leaving behind no ruins for archaeologists to uncover, no monuments for travelers to admire. It was erased so thoroughly that only memory, myth, and fragments of tradition remained. The suddenness of its fall ensured that its story would endure, not as a tale of gradual decline, but as a reminder that greatness, no matter how dazzling, can vanish in the blink of an eye. Though Atlantis vanished beneath the waves in a single night, not all of its people were lost. Thoth's account speaks of survivors who fled the destruction, carrying fragments of their culture across the seas. Their journey was perilous, hunger and uncertainty, yet it ensured that the memory of Atlantis would not disappear entirely. Some survivors escaped in ships, hastily launched as the waters rose. These vessels, once symbols of trade and exploration, became lifeboats carrying families, priests, and scholars into the unknown. They sailed blindly, guided by stars and instinct, searching for lands where they might rebuild. The ocean was merciless, scattering them across distant shores, but a few found refuge. Others fled inland, climbing mountains or seeking higher ground as the seas swallowed the island. They carried with them stories, rituals, and fragments of sacred knowledge. Though they could not save the grandeur of Atlantis, its temples, its libraries, its monuments, they preserved its essence in memory and tradition. Thoth recorded that these survivors became the seeds of new civilizations. In distant lands, they taught farming techniques, shared astronomical knowledge, and introduced rituals that echoed Atlantean practices. Their journey was not only physical, but cultural, a migration of wisdom across continents. The survivors' role was crucial. Without them, Atlantis would have been erased completely, remembered only by the sea. Instead, its legacy lived on in myths, traditions, and fragments of knowledge woven into the fabric of other cultures. Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, all carried echoes of Atlantis, faint but enduring. Their journey was a reminder that even in destruction there is continuity. Civilizations may fall, but survivors carry forward the lessons, ensuring that the story does not end. Atlantis disappeared quickly, but through its survivors, it became immortal, a legend that continues to shape human imagination thousands of years later. Though Atlantis itself was swallowed by the sea, its wisdom did not vanish entirely. Thoth's account emphasizes that fragments of Atlantean knowledge survived, carried by those who escaped the destruction and preserved in traditions across the world. The brilliance of Atlantis lived on, not in its temples or monuments, but in the ideas and practices that its survivors shared. The survivors became wandering teachers. In distant lands, they introduced farming techniques that improved harvests, astronomical observations that aligned rituals with the stars, and healing practices that blended herbs with chants. These fragments of wisdom were woven into the cultures they encountered, becoming seeds of new civilizations. Sacred knowledge was also carried forward in symbols and myths. Geometric patterns, chants, and rituals echoed Atlantean traditions, though often disguised within local customs. Temples aligned with solstices, stories of floods and rebirth, and philosophies of balance all bore traces of Atlantis's legacy. Even when the island itself was forgotten, its essence lived on in the collective memory of humanity. Thoth's writings suggest that this preservation was intentional. He believed wisdom should never be lost, even if civilizations fall. By recording knowledge in texts and symbols, and by guiding survivors to share it, he ensured that Atlantis's brilliance would echo through time. Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, and other cultures carried faint but enduring reflections of Atlantean thought. The knowledge carried forward was not complete. Much was lost to the sea, but what remained was enough to shape the foundations of future societies. Atlantis became immortal, not through its monuments, but through the wisdom that survived its destruction. In this way, the fall of Atlantis was not the end of its story. It was a transformation. The island disappeared, but its knowledge flowed outward like rivers into the ocean of human history, ensuring that its lessons would continue to guide generations long after its towers had crumbled beneath the waves. Among the most intriguing aspects of Atlantis's legacy is the claim that its survivors carried fragments of their wisdom into Egypt. Thoth, often associated with the god of writing and knowledge, is said to have guided this transfer, ensuring that the brilliance of Atlantis would not vanish entirely beneath the waves. The survivors who fled the destruction brought with them sacred knowledge, astronomy, geometry, healing practices, and spiritual traditions. In Egypt, these fragments found fertile ground, temples aligned with the stars, rituals tied to cosmic cycles, and philosophies of balance echoed Atlantean traditions. The pyramids themselves, with their precise geometry and celestial orientation, are often interpreted as reflections of Atlantean engineering and cosmology. Thoth's role was central. As the keeper of wisdom, he became a bridge between Atlantis and Egypt. Legends describe him as the teacher of priests, the scribe of the gods, and the guardian of sacred texts. The emerald tablets, often linked to him, are said to contain Atlantean knowledge preserved for future generations. Through Thoth, Egypt inherited not only fragments of science, but also the philosophy of balance that Atlantis had once cherished. This connection explains why Egypt became one of the world's most enduring civilizations. Its temples, hieroglyphs, and rituals carried echoes of a lost island kingdom, transformed and adapted to new lands. The Atlantean survivors did not rebuild their city, but they ensured that its wisdom lived on in Egypt's foundations. Thus, the link between Atlantis and Egypt is not merely myth, but a symbolic thread. The idea that knowledge, even when civilizations fall, can migrate, adapt, and flourish anew. Atlantis disappeared, but through Egypt, its spirit endured a reminder that wisdom, when preserved, can outlast even the greatest catastrophes. Atlantis could have vanished completely, swallowed by the sea and forgotten by time. Yet Thoth's account ensured that its memory endured. The question is, why? Why did this story survive when so many other civilizations disappeared without a trace? The answer lies in the lessons Atlantis carried. Thoth understood that the fall of a great civilization was not merely history, it was a warning. By preserving the story, He ensured that future generations would remember the dangers of pride, the fragility of balance, and the importance of humility in the face of nature's power. Atlantis was not just a tale of destruction, it was a mirror held up to humanity. The story was also preserved because it inspired awe. Atlantis represented the pinnacle of human achievement. Temples aligned with the stars, canals flowing like veins of silver, wisdom that bridged science and spirituality. Its sudden disappearance made the tale unforgettable, a mystery that demanded retelling. People remembered Atlantis not only for its fall, but for its brilliance, a reminder of what humanity could achieve and what it could lose. Survivors carried fragments of the story into new lands, embedding it in myths, rituals, and traditions. Flood legends across cultures echoed Atlantis's fate, ensuring that even if the island itself was forgotten, its lesson lived on. Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, and countless others preserved pieces of the narrative, weaving them into their own histories. Most importantly, the story endured because it was cyclical. Thoth believed civilizations rise and fall in rhythm, and Atlantis was one example among many. By preserving its memory, he offered guidance for future ages. Wisdom must be tempered with humility. Balance must be protected, and greatness must never blind a people to its own fragility. Atlantis was preserved not as a relic of the past, but as a timeless warning. Its story survived because it was never meant to be forgotten. It was meant to remind humanity, again and again, that even the greatest civilizations can vanish in a single night. The destruction of Atlantis has always carried two layers of meaning: the literal collapse of a great island kingdom, and the symbolic lesson embedded within its fall. Thoth's writings, as interpreted across generations, invite us to see both dimensions. Atlantis's disappearance beneath the waves is often described as a historical event. Earthquakes shattered its foundations, storms tore through its cities, and the ocean swallowed its temples in a single night. To those who take the account literally, Atlantis was a real civilization erased by natural forces, its ruins hidden beneath the sea. The literal destruction serves as a reminder of nature's power and humanity's vulnerability. Others interpret Atlantis's fall as a parable. The island represents the human soul, or the collective spirit of civilization, undone by pride and imbalance. The flood becomes a metaphor for the consequences of arrogance, the collapse of wisdom when it is misused. In this view, Atlantis never needed to exist physically. Its destruction is a timeless allegory about the dangers of forgetting humility. Thoth's account seems deliberately layered. By preserving both the literal and symbolic interpretations, he ensured that Atlantis's story would endure across cultures and ages. For some, it is history. For others, it is myth. For many, it is both. The ambiguity is what gives the tale its power. Atlantis's destruction, whether seen as waves crashing over marble towers or as pride overwhelming wisdom, carries the same lesson: balance must be protected. Civilizations fall when they forget this truth, whether through earthquakes and floods or through arrogance and corruption. Thus, the story of Atlantis survives, not because it is only literal or only symbolic, but because it is both a warning written in the language of history and myth, reminding humanity that greatness without humility can vanish in an instant. Atlantis's tale, as preserved through Thoth's writings and later traditions, is more than a story of grandeur and destruction. Beneath its surface lie lessons carefully woven into the narrative. meant to guide humanity long after the island itself was gone. Atlantis reminds us that no civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to collapse. Towers, temples, and libraries can vanish in a single night if balance is lost. The lesson is clear. Greatness must be tempered with humility, for pride can undo centuries of achievement. Thoth emphasized harmony between humanity, nature, and the divine. Atlantis fell because it strayed from this balance, turning wisdom into power and reverence into spectacle. The hidden lesson is that imbalance, whether in society, environment, or spirit, invites correction, often in ways that are sudden and severe. Sacred wisdom was meant to uplift all, but in Atlantis it became hoarded by elites. This misuse transformed knowledge into a tool of exclusion rather than guidance. The lesson here is that wisdom loses its purity when guarded selfishly. It thrives only when shared. The destruction of Atlantis was not the end, but part of a larger rhythm. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall, and in their fall, they leave behind seeds for renewal. The hidden lesson is that endings are also beginnings, and humanity must learn to carry forward wisdom even in times of loss. Flood myths across cultures echo Atlantis's fate, suggesting that the lesson is not confined to one land but belongs to all humanity. The hidden message is that civilizations everywhere must heed the signs of imbalance, for the cycle of rise and fall is universal. In the end, Atlantis's story is not just about a vanished island. It is a parable, a mirror, and a guide. Its lessons are hidden in its fall, waiting for each generation to uncover them anew, reminders that wisdom must be honored, balance must be preserved, and humility must never be forgotten. The fall of Atlantis, as Thoth described it, was not only a story of the past, but a warning for the future. Civilizations rise, flourish, and collapse in cycles, and the question that lingers is whether humanity today could face a similar fate. Signs in the modern world: environmental imbalance, rising seas, shifting climates, and natural disasters echo the warnings Thoth recorded. Misuse of knowledge. Technology, like sacred wisdom in Atlantis, can uplift or destroy depending on how it is wielded. Pride and power, just as Atlantean rulers believed themselves invincible. Modern societies risk arrogance when they ignore the limits of nature. The lesson of cycles. Thoth's teachings remind us that destruction is not chaos, but correction. If imbalance grows too great, nature restores harmony. The fall of Atlantis was sudden, but its lesson is timeless. Civilizations must respect balance or risk being undone by forces greater than themselves. Could it happen again? Yes, not necessarily in the same form, but in spirit. Floods, quakes, storms, or even human-made crises could bring about sudden collapse. The story of Atlantis endures because it warns us that brilliance without humility is fragile. The cycle of rise and fall continues, and humanity must decide whether it will learn from the past or repeat it. And so, the tale of Atlantis drifts into memory, its lessons carried like whispers across the ages. Whether literal or symbolic, its fall reminds us to tread carefully, to honor wisdom, and to keep balance at the heart of our lives. The waves that swallowed Atlantis are long gone, but their echo still reaches us, urging reflection. Close your eyes now, let the story settle like a gentle tide, and carry its lessons into your dreams. Atlantis has spoken, and for tonight, its voice grows quiet. Good night.